and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today, for something a little bit different, I'm going to talk about an issue of The Sandman from way back in time. It's an issue from Neil Gaiman's The Sandman, and it's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is issue 19, and it was illustrated by the great Charles Vess. And the reason I want to talk about this is because, well, not only was it my very first attempt at doing an academic paper, it was the first thing I presented on, but how narrative is conveyed in this comic book is so much fun. There's so much interesting stuff going on in terms of the story being told and the worlds being set up, and what you could refer to as different diegetic levels, as the interplay of various aspects within the diegesis, and there's even a metaleptic event. There's lots of really good narrative stuff going on. And I found out that there's an audible version of The Sandman. So I'm really curious to hear it, because I don't know how they're going to convey all of the information that Vess put into the narrative with Gaiman's script and direction. It was the two of them working together to create this really powerful story. And also, there's going to be a Sandman TV show. And this is really interesting because the comic book is so specific about how it framed things that when the TV show is eventually made, I'm going to be fascinated to see how they do this particular issue. So, without further ado, I'll try, and I don't know how good the scans are going to be, but I'll try to get a couple of the images so you can see what I'm talking about when I'm talking through this. So, Midsummer Night's Dream was issue 19 of The Sandman, and lots of people have talked about this. This is, one of the most famous comic book series, and comic book scholars have typically sort of moved on from this. This is going back to the heyday of comic books suddenly getting a little bit of recognition by the literary establishment. And there's some really good comic book scholars, and I'm sure that someone else has done this since I looked at it. And certainly, even at the time, there was an academic called Joe Sanders who did a brilliant article in, I think it was Extrapolation, which I found out after I'd written the vast majority of this, that he'd covered some of the same material. I came to slightly different conclusions, but Joe Sanders in Extrapolation did this before I did. But what I want to look at here is the comic in terms of the meta-narrative and the ideas of multiple and parallel realities, and how this is achieved through both the textual referencing and the use of the artwork. In particular, how the art itself not only illustrates the text, but is an added dimension to the narrative and supplies its own coded information to the reader. So the brief plot overview, or the narrative context. Dream, central character of the series, commissions 2 plays from a relatively, at the time, unknown playwright called William Shakespeare. In exchange for Shakespeare writing Dream 2 plays, Dream allows Shakespeare access to the library that he controls, which are all of the greatest stories that people have ever dreamt up. And this is the very first play that Shakespeare's written for Dream. This is the premiere of the play, and it is being performed in front of the fairy, Oberon, Titania, Puck, and several of the others. And this play is A Midsummer Night's Dream. Any analysis of this story is complicated by the number of different story elements, intertextual, metatextual, fractal relationships between plot, narrative, theme. So let's have a look at some specific instances which may illustrate, sorry, I honestly couldn't resist, that will illustrate what I'm talking about. So the first thing I want to look at here is the title page. So not the front cover, not the very first page of the comic book, but it's a couple of pages in. And in this instance, it depicts Dream greeting the fairy host above the title and the sort of publication information. So the illustration, the full page splash with a 3-panel insert, attains huge amounts of significance because not only is it the title page, but there's no text boxes, no speech boxes. It's just the title and the publication sort of information at the bottom. And the narrative is told very simply, but very persuasively through the artwork. And the lack of the text or the dialogue or otherwise emphasizes the artwork, but also draws focus to what text is available, i.e. the title itself. And if you didn't notice, draws focus. Oh, okay, I'll stop with the puns. But the title itself is an example of the complex inter and intra textual narrative elements used by both Gaiman and all of the artists that worked on the series. But in this instance, it addresses 4 main points. Firstly, it's the title of the issue, pure and simple. It's the name of the story that we're about to read. But secondly, it draws an obvious parallel to Shakespeare's play of the same name. It mightn't come across clearly in the video, but the text below the title reads, written by Neil Gaiman with additional material taken from the play by William Shakespeare. The action of this story constantly mirrors, mimics, and plays with both Shakespeare's reality as well as the play A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare. All of it's woven into this particular story. Thirdly, the title actually foreshadows and describes much of the plot. The importance of this is only apparent after reading through the issue, but the story occurs during a midsummer's day, possesses a dreamlike quality, and ends with a descent into darkness and night, so A Midsummer Night's Dream. And lastly, there's the not so subtle reference to the title character, Dream. The title, you could reorganize the title as, this is a story about Dream on one particular midsummer night. But what's really interesting is Gaiman and Vess divide the action of the story into 4 distinct and discrete areas. And they use various clues to help us as the reader navigate the differing levels of reality created. So the 4 areas are backstage, onstage, the Royal Arbor, and the Peanut Gallery. In this illustration here, you can see all 4 areas at once. The bright, sunlit backstage area, firmly in the midday reality of Elizabethan England. The onstage area, which represents this sort of fictional reality. Yes, it is partly in the real world, but what occurs on it is a narrative construction. And then you can see, hopefully you can see here that Vess has used a shading border to demarcate a division between the stage and the Royal Arbor. There's a barrier between them, a border. And this separation is subtly emphasized by a change in the coloring, which signals a transition into twilight or evening time. So we've moved from the daytime of backstage, but where Dream and the Fae are all sitting, suddenly moved into this twilight, this evening time, the witching hour, a magical part of the evening, which is associated with the fairy. And it becomes even more pronounced the further into the Peanut Gallery we go. So there's a clear progression of narrative realities. They're all connected, but they are all slightly distinct. So looking at the first area, the backstage area, it's firmly based in the real world. It's the most mimetic of all of the realms of existence that this particular issue covers. It's a normal, everyday reality where the actors relate to each other. They speak to each other as people. They ask about their day, and they watch the audience from behind the stage. But an important aspect of backstage with a theater company is this is where the magic happens. And this is where the actors transform themselves through mundane means, admittedly, but they transform themselves into characters of old or fantastic origin. And in this slide, you can see how one of the young male actors has completely transformed into a beautiful young girl. Now, in the Sanders article that I referred to earlier, he had suggested that this reflects the influence of the fairy presence already going into the backstage area. But I would more argue that this is the human equivalent of fairy glamour magic. Because despite its appearance of magic, despite this being the illusion that is created by theater and makeup and wigs and costuming, it's entirely mundane. And we can see here that Vess's bright colors emphasize that this is the waking world, the daylight world, the Elizabethan reality. And the second area of distinct action is that of the stage itself. Now, stages are curious places because they're a blend of reality as we understand it, but also a fictive fantasy, a made up world. The action is physically taking place. You know, actors walk backwards and forwards and wave swords around. They are physically there, but it's not a real sword fight. It's a fictional sword fight. It's a reality created by the actors for the entertainment or amusement of the audience. And there's this really fine line then that is constantly being crossed between what is real and what is unreal. And what makes it so interesting in relation to this issue is that this fine line is further complicated by the fact that the action on stage, what is happening in the play by William Shakespeare called The Midsummer Night's Dream, is mimicking and referring to the past actions of some of the audience members. And that the people that the characters are based on are sitting in the audience watching. And we're never sure if the play Shakespeare has written, at least as presented in the Sandman universe, is actually based, however loosely, on past exploits of Oberon and Titania, or if it is completely made up. Moving on then to the royal audience in their little private arbor. And this is a third arena of action. It is distinct from the human world. None of the characters here are actually human, but they're located between that twilight of the fairy world and the brightness of the human world. They're in something of a borderland between the realities. So although there is this darkness of the cool evening coloring, which suggests they are on the fairy side of the divide, the distinction over reality is complicated. Not only by the correlation between the characters on stage and the actual royals, but we must also consider the fact that the action on stage is mimicked in certain respects by the actions of Dream, Oberon, and Titania, as the play contains scenes of royalty watching a play put on by commoners, just as Dream, Oberon, and Titania are royalty watching a play put on by commoners. Oberon and Titania are characters involved in lovers' schemes and plights in the play. And as we see in this particular issue of The Sandman, there is a very strong subtext that Oberon, Titania, and Dream are involved in lovers' schemes and plights. But these people are otherworldly beings who inhabit a different plane of existence. Yet they're physically present in the real world of the actors. They are royalty, so they're removed from the commoner or ordinary sphere that the actors usually inhabit. So even if Dream, Oberon, and Titania were human, they are royalty. They inhabit a different sphere of reality. removed from the common man playing the parts on the stage. So there's a significant level of interconnectivity between fantasy and reality, fact and fiction, between the play, the situation, and everything that is occurring. The last distinct area that we see is the peanut gallery, this collection of characters that seem to represent the everyman. So despite their otherworldliness and despite the fact that they look so strange, they are very much like the rude mechanicals that appear in the play by Shakespeare. They provide much of the comic relief. They supply a commentary on both the actors and the royals. And through their comments and commentary, we see beyond their strange appearance to direct comparisons to that of human characters, spectators of grand affairs. And once again, this draws parallels to the characters in Shakespeare's play, as well as the human actors performing it in this story. They are the ultimate observers. And with their peculiar use of language, particularly for this time period, it's reminiscent of modern day colloquial language. There are parallels between the common fairy folk and the reader. They, like the reader, are the furthest removed from the action. They're also the least humanoid, and so straddle the divide beyond the objective reality of the reader as observer, commentator, and magical character part of a fictional reality. In effect, their presence further blurs the distinction between the fictive reality of the Sandman, the comic book series, and the world of the reader, drawing one into the other, whilst at the same time we're seeing a blurring of two distinct worlds within the text which interact on multiple levels. But turning now to Vess's artwork, we can see how he delineates the two fictional realities and then communicates plot progression by manipulating those self-same rules. So while initially the human world is present in bright daytime colors, vividly represented, and the fairy who are watching the play as it's performed sit in a gloom of a magical twilight, a color scheme which allows for easy recognition of which reality is being represented. As the story progresses, the human world becomes darker, which obviously notes both the passage of time as afternoon turns into evening, turns into night, but also how the human world, because it is in such close proximity to fairy, is being drawn deeper into the magical reality of fairy. Or we could look at it as the realm of fairy, which we saw announce itself and walk in to watch this play, is intruding further and further into the mimetic reality. And as their worlds draw closer, the parallels between the four distinct areas become stronger and the differences blur. As the time progresses in the human world, Vess illustrates this by bringing the color scheme of the human world into sync with the fairy twilight. So the blending of the color schemes reinforces the idea of the merging of the two realities. And this is furthered by the narrative events of the story and also by Vess's choice to start merging the actual frames of the comic into one another. The incursion of the fairy into the human world in the beginning of the story is then symbolically extended further by the presence of the fairy in the previously discrete human backstage area, and this occurs during the intermission. This is then compounded by Puck replacing the actor Dick Cowley, who was portraying him on stage. So the idea of Puck playing a human, playing Puck, in a story about the interaction of the fairy and human worlds gives you an idea of the multi-layered complexity of the story, despite its apparent simplicity, despite being something that you think of as straightforward. And this fractal recursion of story within story within story can be really difficult to visualize. And the intermingling of multiple realities can be really hard to picture And yet that is exactly what Vess's artwork conveys. But at this stage, the fairy have infiltrated all of the different layers of the reality in the narrative. But let's look specifically at the royal trio of Dream, Oberon, and Titania. And I think we can tease out some important points of discussion. When we first see them, Dream greets Oberon first. And this gives the reader the impression that Oberon is of a higher social standing than Titania. Dream is greeting the most important person first. However, Vess's illustration has Titania dominating the actual frame, and Oberon set more as her escort. And when we see the trio seated in the arbor, it is Titania who is seated on Dream's right as guest of honor, not Oberon. In fact, Vess seems to have been at pains to draw Dream and Titania together as often as possible. And several times during the course of the issue, Dream and Titania are very discreetly framed, and Oberon is excluded, despite it being very likely that if this was a camera shot, Oberon would have been visible in the background. And Vess has included several shots of Dream looking directly at Titania and Titania looking directly at Dream. But in this current frame, we can see how Vess has framed the trio in a very particular way. Dream and Titania are seated close together. They're sharing a single armrest. Their arms are touching. There is an ease and familiarity in their contact and their attitude to one another. On the other hand, Oberon is depicted as sitting separately to the other two. In fact, his right arm is forming a vertical barrier along with the undergrowth that frames him as a discrete, separate, isolated unit. And then we consider Vess's choice of color and representation of the clothing. So Oberon has bright red armor, and this sets him apart from the bluer hued and soft looking clothing that Dream and Titania are wearing. And Dream and Titania are depicted as having hair colors similar in nature rather than the very definitive and different bright yellow of Oberon's hair. And a further thing to consider is Oberon has horns on his head. And up until this point, it's been very easy to dismiss this as simply because of his fae or fairy nature, because we've seen how strange and wonderful a number of the fairy creatures look. However, considering the closeness of Dream and Titania and the subject matter of the play they are watching, which concerns Titania being unfaithful, and the fact that it's a Shakespearean play, we can arrive at the subtle inference that Oberon is in fact a cuckold. And when these points are all added together, Vess has clearly implanted the idea in the reader's head that Dream and Titania are either having or have had an affair. And these next couple of images kind of show how Vess has framed Dream and Titania, so often to the exclusion of Oberon. It's as if Oberon has been omitted from the intimate reality created by Dream and Titania between themselves. But to exclude the consideration of text is just as damning to exclude consideration of the artwork when it comes to analyzing graphic novels and comics and things like this. And in this frame in particular, we can see how Dream, normally not the most talkative of characters, has opened up to Titania and is attempting to articulate the reasons for his actions. And this was prompted by an earlier point posed to him by Titania, which he is now attempting to answer. And she had asked, "Would that I could fathom your motives." There's an intimacy and ease of familiarity generated between the two, both through this unusual act on Dream's part, because he's usually so taciturn and closed off and refuses to share anything about himself, and through the images of their faces in such close proximity. In the bottom left panel, we can see the glitter of Dream's eye as he looks at Titania. Now, this is perfectly acceptable in terms of the reality of the fictive reality of the Sandman, because Dream is frequently described as having these stars glowing in his eyes. But it does convey this connotation of looking at someone with a twinkle in their eye, a representation of desire, love, or some kind of relationship. And this inference is continued here, where we can see that Oberon has clearly stated that the fairy will not be returning. But it's then Titania who is very quick to invite Dream to visit them. And let's look at this text and see how it can be interpreted in terms of additional information. So Titania's offer, "But you will always be welcome in our land, Dreamlord. The gates to fairy are never fully closed. Come when you wish." On the one hand, an entirely above board invitation from one royal to another in response to this generous act of putting on a play for them. However, when we consider the fact that we've seen this level of intimacy, we've seen the horns on Oberon's head, when we've seen Dream and Titania looking at one another, when we've seen the trust between them and how closely they're sitting together, this would imply that potentially Titania's making a slightly covert move on Dream, asking him to potentially resume their relationship because the gates are never fully closed. And curiously, when I had been working on this all those years ago, Charles Vess very kindly pointed out to me that he had framed Oberon quite frequently with Puck. And he had said at that time that he'd imagined that Oberon was actually in a relationship with Puck. And that's why there's a great shot of Oberon gently caressing Puck's head. But that's a whole other thing that you would have to unpack in this. But the very last thing that I wanted to talk about, and I thought was interesting here, is this idea of the interrelating realities. And I want to look at Puck's adieu. And at this point in the story, the fairy have left, all the actors are fast asleep. And so these famous last lines of the play are delivered by Puck for the reader, solely for the reader, and to the reader. And the first panel obviously recalls that iconic image of Hamlet talking to the skull, where Puck is talking to the mask. But Vess has Puck discard the mask in favor of turning to address the reader directly. And then creates the impression of the images zooming in whilst Puck slowly and effectively disappears into the shadows. And this changes the tone of the usually reassuring last lines of this play into something far more threatening and far more sinister. And this has the combined effect of both bringing the reader further into the fictional world of the Sandman, where you're being brought into the pages of the comic book, but at the same time of the fictional world of the Sandman, of the fictional world of the comic book, escaping out of the pages. So just as the fairy entered the Shakespearean world at the beginning of the story, now Puck is escaping the bounds of the comic book to enter ours. So there's no big critical framework here. There's no big point that I'm trying to make. But what I'm saying is, this is a fascinating look at how you can play with reality, perception of reality. And I think this is just such a fascinating comic book that people should go out, and even if they don't want to read the whole series, they should read this one because it is absolutely fantastic. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.